Acts 23, we're going to start in verse 25, and I'm going to try to finish the chapter. We'll see how it goes. I don't know. It's kind of a long way to go, but we'll see what happens. Most of it is rehashing information that we already know, because this is where the chief captain writes a letter, remember? He sends Paul to see Felix, and so he sends him along with a bunch of soldiers and a letter. And so it picks up there, and I'm going to read verses 25 through 30 just to kind of get us thinking, get the context a little bit. Starting in verse 25, it says, "He wrote a letter after this manner. Claudius Lysias, unto the most excellent governor Felix, sendeth greeting. This man was taken of the Jews, and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army, and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. And when I would have known the cause wherefore they accused him, I brought him forth unto their council, whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law, but to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or of bonds. And when it was told me how that the Jews laid wait for the man, I sent straightway to thee, and gave commandment to his accusers also to say before thee what they had against him. Farewell." So that's the end of his letter. So the chief captain now, he has taken quite a group of soldiers, and they have escorted Paul by night to what city? No, they left Jerusalem. Where are they going to? Where? Caesarea. Paul just came from Caesarea. He was at Caesarea, he goes to Jerusalem, now he's going back to Caesarea on his way to Rome. We know he's on his way to Rome because Jesus told Paul that he had to go to Rome. So obviously he's on his way now back to Rome, and Caesarea was a very important spot to go through on your way to Rome, but it was also an important spot because that's where Felix was. And Felix, being the high-ranking person that he is, that would be the next level up in their authority, and so he goes to see, sends Paul to see Felix with a large army of people protecting him at night. He gets to Caesarea, and they deliver a letter to Felix. And so verse 25 says, after this, he wrote a letter after this manner. So the chief captain himself doesn't really make the trip. He doesn't go with them. He stays behind, and he sends a letter on his behalf. So in verse 26, it says, Claudius Lysias. That's interesting to me because that's really the first place where we get to know this guy's name. Think about it up to this point, and I think I actually asked a trivia question about this a few weeks ago. But other than that, up to this point, it's always just been the chief captain, the chief captain, the chief captain. But now we finally learn his name. His name is Claudius Lysias, and he writes, Claudius Lysias unto the most excellent governor Felix. Let's pause there for a moment. Do you remember last week when I was telling you about Felix? Would you agree that he was the most excellent governor? No? Why not? His lineage. Yeah, his family. I mean, we got Nero, we got Nero's mom, we got his cousin, we got the wife of this person, and, the death of these people. And so we wouldn't exactly rate Felix up there as the most excellent governor. But don't get the idea that the chief captain is trying to butter him up. That's not really the case. It reads that way in English, but if you think back to that culture, and it's still true even in Asian culture, and I guess it's even true in American culture, if the president walked in, if you liked him or you didn't like him, you would still address him appropriately, and this was the appropriate way to address Felix, who was the governor, and this was his title, the most excellent governor. Remember, nowadays we have ways that we're supposed to do it, and we're taught when we speak to the president, what do we call him?
Mr. President.
Mr. President. That is what we call him. That's what we do. You have the same sort of similar thing in Korea, but back then they were addressed this way: the most excellent governor. That was the way you addressed him in writing, or often even in speaking. So it's not like he's trying to butter him up. All right, that was just the traditional way of opening the letter from one who was a lower rank to one that was a higher rank, or lower to higher authority. That's the way you open the letter. So he's not trying to butter him up. He's not trying to get in on his good side. And really, he's got no need to do that anyway. I mean, what is Paul to him, right? He doesn't even really know him very well. But he writes this letter, and so that's the way he opens it. So in verse 27, he begins to explain Paul's case. He said, this man was taken to the Jews and should have been killed of them. Would have been killed of them, all right? Had Claudius Lysias not stepped in. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. So if you read the letter, and you think about what the chief captain wrote, you're going to note that the chief captain paints himself out in a bit of a, more of an altruistic kind of way, He's been a good guy, and he's kept everything on board, and he was, just a fine, outstanding, and kind of intellectual person with good reasoning abilities and the whole situation. But the reality is not exactly the same. In this case, he claims that he knew that Paul was a Roman. But he didn't. If you remember, he didn't know Paul was a Roman. In fact, they had gone out and they had snatched him up and saved him from getting beat half to death by the Sanhedrin, took him up to the Castle Antonio, and then after Antonia, that was a joke, Antonio, never mind. Antonia, when they get him up there, they have him tied up, and they're gonna beat him. And that's when Paul finally says, what does the law say about beating a Roman before he's tried? And all brakes go on. Remember that? So in the first situation, when the chief captain goes out to save Paul from the Jews, he doesn't know he's a Roman. He's got no clue he's a Roman. In fact, if you remember, he thought that he was that, Egyptian that was leading a revolt. So that's what he thought about Paul. But in his letter, he doesn't really say that. He says, this man was taken to the Jews and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. So he kind of paints himself out as to knowing more than what he actually knew. He didn't really know that. In fact, he didn't even suspect that, okay? He apprehended Paul, was getting ready to beat him, and that's when he finds out that he is actually a Roman. So in his letter, the point being, in his letter, Claudius Lysias is being political, I guess you'd say. Being kind of political. He's not really lying, but he's lying, okay? He's kind of giving an overview of the case, but he's making himself look pretty good all the while he's doing it. So look at verse 28. He says, and when I would have known the cause wherefore they accused him, I brought him forth into their council. Now this part is pretty true, because if you remember, when he first took Paul, he took Paul up there and they found out this. He had no clue why the Sanhedrin and why the Jews were angry. He had no clue why they wanted to kill Paul. It's pretty clear they wanted to kill him, but he had no idea why. And so that part's true. He was not sure whether or not he could believe Paul's explanation. So he was going to find out the truth of the matter. And so remember, the very next day after he saved Paul and arrested Paul overnight, the next day he's going to set up like a little meeting with Paul and the Sanhedrin to get to the bottom of it. And as you know, that didn't really turn out quite the way that he planned. But he does that. So this part is really true. He didn't know why the Jews were angry, and all he knew was Paul's explanation, and he's not really sure how much stock he could put in that. So he's going to know more, and he sets up. And so he explains all of this to Festus, that this is what he did to get to the bottom of the matter. He has taken certain steps to try to fix this problem before it has to get that far. So verse 29, he says, whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law. So he tells him, he didn't exactly say this. I didn't know this for a fact, but just looking at the situation and all that was going on there, it seemed like one of their religious law kind of things. That's his point. He says, I perceived that that's what it was, but to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or of bonds. Now, it sounds like a simple statement, and it is a simple statement, but there's a couple of things that we can take away from this, all right? First of all, the chief captain, again, makes himself appear as if he's kind of wise in this affair, and that he can see, perceiving in the situation that, that this was a religious thing, when actually, in the actual occurrence at this point, when, he's discussing it, he really had very little idea of what was going on. All he knew is that the city's in an uproar and they're going to kill that guy on my watch without a trial. I better get down there and stop this. That's all that he was thinking at the time. The second thing that we draw away from this is, what was the Romans, and I'll let you work this one out for yourself, what was the Romans thinking about religious violations?
They left it to them if it was minor.
I'm sorry?
They left it to them if it was minor violations to take care of within themselves.
All right, so they didn't take those kinds of violations to trial.
Not to the Romans.
Okay.
Within themselves, and only the minor.
All right, good. Anybody else want to add to that?
And at least as long as you pay tribute to Caesar on some way, you do whatever you want.
Very good.
More or less.
More? Anyone? Okay, the Romans' position is very simple to understand. As long as you show the appropriate levels of respect, and by the way, at this point, the Caesars had not considered themselves to be gods yet. That's coming. It's well on its way. Within the next 100 years that happens. But not yet. Okay, we're still in the first half of the first century here. The Caesars expect not to be worshipped, but expect to be greatly, greatly respected. Give unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and give unto God that which is God's. They expected that you were going to do everything that the Romans said. And as long as you did all of that, if you broke somebody else's little religious law somewhere, they didn't much care about that. That's a little local matter. You guys take care of that. We don't care about that. However, the caveat to that was, if it was a death penalty kind of thing, the Romans had to be the ones to do that. Now, the Sanhedrin could have found Paul guilty of blasphemy. I mean, that's what they did with Jesus. They could have found Paul guilty of blasphemy and then, gone to the Roman authorities and said, we found him guilty of blasphemy and we want to kill him. At that point, the Romans would have said, no. Why? Because there was nothing in the Roman law worthy of death. Now, going back to the trial of Jesus, is that what happened? No. Pilate said, you take him, crucify him. I wash my hands of this. Which really, technically speaking, according to Roman law, was not the right thing to do. But that's what happened. In Paul's case, that does not happen. In Paul's case, Claudius Lysias says, not on my watch. They're not going to kill some guy on my watch without a trial. So he sends him up to Felix, pointing out very clearly that it was a religious thing, not a Roman thing. Now, imagine for a moment that you are the governor. You're not Felix, you're the governor. You're you, but you're the governor. You get a letter and you get a prisoner with 200 and some soldiers guarding him. And this is obviously a big deal. When a big parade comes into town with a letter for you, it's a big deal. You get the letter, you read the letter. You don't have to do this because it is a religious matter. You can do this if you want to. You could take the case or you could not take the case. What would you do? What would you do? Kenny, what would you do? Huh?
Send him back.
You'd send him back to his death?
Not my problem. I don't think this is, I don't know. I actually don't know what I would do.
What would you do?
I would take the case. I mean, if
You would take the case. Why?
if Claudius thought that this was something that warranted 200 souls protecting him, even though it's a religious matter, it seemed like it must be quite important.
Okay, so you take the case because it's obviously important and it needs to be solved. All right? Anyone else? Cole, what would you do? Same thing? I would take the case only because I would want to make sure that justice was done. I mean, a Roman soldier really doesn't have a dog in the fight. But he's gone through all of this to make sure that this man gets a fair trial. So I would make sure he got a fair trial. But you are not bound to do that. Felix very well could have said, no, I'm not going to take this case. And we know from reading later that he does, but he didn't have to. It didn't involve social order or respect towards Caesar at all. And, whatever he'd done wrong, it wasn't worthy of death. So he could have just kind of pushed that back down, I guess, if he wanted to, but that's not what he did. Now look at verse 30. It says, and when it was told me how that the Jews laid wait for the man, I sent straightway to thee, and gave commandment to his accusers also to say before thee what they had against him. Farewell. And there's the end of the letter. So obviously, this was not done before the chief captain had sent Paul away, for otherwise they would know Paul was leaving and may put him in danger again. So obviously this was done after he left. Does everybody follow what I'm saying? Most likely had, let me see if I can say it a better way. He would have had to have done this after Paul was well on his way, because if the Sanhedrin or anybody else would have known this, certainly somebody would have tried to lie in wait and kill him with a poisonous arrow from a mountainside somewhere, or who knows. But he wasn't going to just simply walk from Jerusalem to Caesarea when they all want him dead. 40 guys have sworn to starve themselves to death if they can't kill Paul first. So this is the mindset that they're dealing with, but obviously that doesn't happen. So he sends a letter, and I imagine Felix reads the letter. In verse 31 it says, then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. So now they go further. They take him to Antipatris. Antipatris was a new city. It sounds like a name. Can anybody think of the name it sounds like? You should probably know this name. Who? No? Now you're guessing.
Is it Antipatris?
And what?
Antipatris?
No.
Is there something?
I'll give you the first word. Herod.
Zero Antipatus? Antipas.
Okay. Herod Antipas. Okay. So he named the city. The city had been built by Herod the Great, and he named it for his father. And it was positioned on the Roman road and midway between Caesarea and Lydda. So the soldiers stopped there. I guess they probably stopped there, to rest, because they left at about 9 p.m. and they traveled through the night. So I imagine that they're tired, and they stopped there. And then verse 32 says, on the morrow they left the horsemen to go with him and returned to the castle. So verse 31 tells us about all the soldiers. They go to Antipatris, and then the next day they left the horsemen to go with him and returned to the castle. So at this point, a good group of the soldiers went back, but not the soldiers that are on horses, and that would also mean, of course, Paul is still on a horse. And so they go on. So at this point, the threat to Paul has been greatly reduced, and so that many soldiers are no longer required. And it's just common military sense. You don't put a whole bunch of soldiers somewhere when they're not really required and leave the city of Jerusalem, which always has problems, alone. So a good group of them come back, of course, to the city of Jerusalem. And the footmen, so they all return, and so the horsemen continue on from there. Verse 23 says, who, when they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. So in the New Testament we have the epistle to the Romans, and we have the first epistle to the Corinthians, and the second epistle to the Corinthians, and so on. So just from this verse, what does epistle mean? Letter. And what we read earlier was what? 4 or 5 verses long? and he called it an epistle. So basically, epistle means a letter, and that kind of gives you a clue. And so they take the letter to the governor, they present Paul also before him. Now the governor is, of course, Felix, who is the current governor in Judea, okay? We learned that from Acts 23 verse 24, that he is the governor of Judea. So in verse 34 it says, "And when the governor had read the letter, he asked of what province he was. And when he understood that he was of Cilicia," so there's a reason for the question. Why would he ask that question? He reads the letter, Paul is there, and then after he reads the letter, he kind of looks up and looks around a little bit for a minute, and then he says, what province is this from?
Authority?
All right, so we're looking at authority. That's right. So the question seems to be to verify the facts as concerning, Paul's citizenship. Because Jerusalem is not in Cilicia, so that's not his question. He knows, Jerusalem. He knows Jerusalem is Judea, and he knows that that is his authority. But Paul's not from Judea. He is from what city? Anybody remember? Tarsus. And Tarsus is in Cilicia. All right? So now he knows for a fact that Paul's citizenship is Roman, and now he knows that he clearly has jurisdiction to take the case, because Paul being a Roman. But in any case, though he was superior, he didn't have to take the case. It was at this point his option. He didn't have to if he didn't want to, but of course we know he does. He could have easily placed the problem in Herod's hands. Remember who Herod was? I mean, I don't mean by name, but his position. What was he? Well, first of all, how many Herods were there? Yeah, well, Herod's not a name, it's a job. Okay? So you can read about several Herods in the Bible, but there were at one point 4 Herods at one time. And each Herod had a certain amount of jurisdiction over certain areas. Remember in the trials of Jesus? And Pilate finds out that Jesus was from where? Wow, do we need to go back to the Gospels?
Galilee.
From Galilee. And so what does he do? Pilate says, there's my out. I got a way out of this now. And he sends him to Herod, because that was Herod's jurisdiction. He says, well, he belongs there. I can send him over there. So he sends him over there. Of course, Herod, they send him back in the whole 9 yards. You know how the trial of Jesus went. But the reality is, he could have put the case in Herod's hands. That was perfectly legal according to Roman law, but he doesn't do that. He decides instead to take the case. And Herod, by the way, Herod was in Caesarea as well. He was in Caesarea. In fact, he also had a judgment hall there. Okay? So he could have done that, but he doesn't do that. He decides to keep the case. Now look at verse 35. In verse 35 it says, and he says, I will hear thee, said he, when thine accusers are also come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. So the very last verse of chapter 23, what do we have? We have Felix saying, okay, I'll take the case, but I'm not going to try the case yet. I'm going to wait for his accusers to come. When is that going to be? Well, it's not going to be the next day, because they don't even know Paul's gone yet. I mean, he was just kind of snuck out of town, right? So maybe they do. Maybe this is the next day, and maybe they found out the next day, and they're like, oh, we missed our chance. Maybe now they know Paul's gone. But they're certainly nowhere close by. So, yes, sir.
I'm thinking they had a good idea maybe when the army rode out of town.
Well, when the army rode out of town at 9 o'clock at night, they snuck him out. Remember? They went out quietly, all wearing their special army shoes, sneakers. Anyway, they snuck out of town, and there was really no indication, at least from the scriptures, that they would know that. I'm assuming somebody would have heard the horses or woke up and looked out the window or whatever, but nothing to really let them know that Paul was being snuck out of town. Okay, but why would you use that many people to sneak one guy out of town? That's what I would be thinking. I wouldn't look out my window and see, close to 300. If you add it all up, it's like 270. What was it? 273 soldiers or something like that. You don't look out at a group of soldiers that large and think, oh, they're sneaking one man out of town. You don't think that way, So they wouldn't have thought that. So they're nowhere. His accusers are nowhere nearby. By the way, before we get into the next chapter, let's discuss who his accusers are. Who are his accusers? I'm sorry?
Pharisees and Sadducees.
I was wanting to bring up on that because, we knew they was divided, whenever he said of the resurrection. But
Okay.
after that, they may have kind of settled out, well, he's trying to do something here, now we're all back together.
All right, so the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which made up the Sanhedrin, is okay. Not really.
High priest.
How did he ever get in front of the Sanhedrin to start off with? Do you remember the situation? He rides into Jerusalem. He goes to meet James, the leader of the church, the pastor of the church of Jerusalem, and him and the deacons were sitting around. Yes, sir.
It was the chief priests and the council.
The council meaning the Sanhedrin? Because that's who the Sanhedrin is.
Yeah.
All right, so hold on to that thought. He rides into town, he meets with James, and James says, I need you to do something for me. We got to quiet down, the believing Jews that are all worked up. They think you're trying to throw out the whole Old Testament. So let's quiet this down. I want you to identify yourself with these guys who have taken an oath. Remember that? And so he goes into the temple. He's in the temple for the oath with those guys. Presumably it's the last day, which, if he was there for all of it, it would have been 7 days. He would have been there for that part, which closed up the oath. And some Jews that knew he was hanging out with a Gentile guy said, he brought a Gentile in here. So they're his accusers. They grab Paul and they drag him out. And that's when the Sanhedrin finally gets involved. The Sanhedrin is not really his accusers. That's a key point. Because the accusers that are supposed to speak to Felix never showed up. And we'll see that in the very next chapter. Okay? Any other questions? Or any other comments? I really don't want to jump into chapter 24. I could, but I don't want to. I don't like to break things up like that. But chapter 24 is exciting. It's almost entirely concerned with this trial before Felix. And you come to the end of the chapter kind of liking Felix. And you're kind of going, why do I like Felix? Because he's kind of a scoundrel. We know that from history. But you come to the end and you go, I kind of like this guy. He's really not that bad after all. He's not a great guy. I wouldn't be inviting him over for dinner or anything like that. But, you don't come away from him going, what a scoundrel anymore. But we'll get to that. Any other questions or comments before we close? All right. If not, let's go ahead and close with a word of prayer. And we'll be dismissed. And Brother Kenny, why don't you pray for us?